Everyone. You're all very welcome to this final module of this series of webinars, which is about the EDQM inspection program. So my name is Oisin Daly and I'm a GMP inspector here in the Certification of Substances Department in EDQM. And so today myself and my colleague Thomas Hecker will take you through everything related to the EDQM inspection program. So this first presentation from me is just a general presentation about the EDQM inspection program, and then my colleague will take you through some aspects relating to inspection preparation and also some common GMP deficiencies that we come across. You're more than welcome to submit questions via the chat, and we just have one request when submitting a question. If you could please just include my name or Thomas's name at the start of the question, just so we know who it's addressed to and who should answer it. And of course, if we don't get to any of the questions, we can follow up via the help desk afterwards. So here's the outline then for my presentation. So first, I'll run through some background information about the CEP procedure and how inspections fit into this. Then I'll try to answer the series of questions of who, what, where, when, and why in the context of the EDQM inspection program. I'll then run through what a typical EDQM inspection looks like and what are the possible inspection outcomes. And then after that, I'll touch on some of the other approaches we use for GMP or the supervision of GMP compliance. So these would include real-time remote inspections. We use the acronym called Artemis, so you may hear us refer to it as that, and what we also call GMP assessment. And then to finish, I'll just provide some information on our international collaboration and also some final perspectives and considerations. So firstly, just to provide some background to the CEP procedure, and I know some of you may have heard a lot of information about this over the previous days if you tuned into some of the other webinars, but just in case, I'll just give a brief overview to provide some context. So CEP stands for Certificate of Suitability to the Monographs of the European Pharmacopoeia. So as the name implies, this would only be for substances which have monographs available. And there are three types of CEPs, a chemical CEP, a herbal CEP, and a TSE CEP. So for the chemical and herbal CEPs, the purpose will be to demonstrate that the quality of the substance is adequately controlled by the European Pharmacopoeia and any additional tests if needed. And for the TSE CEP, this would be just to demonstrate compliance with the general monograph on TSE in the European Pharmacopoeia. Okay, so then just in terms of the CEP procedure itself, so this is an international platform for the assessment of the quality of substances for pharmaceutical use. So this would be mostly for active pharmaceutical ingredients, of course. And again, I mentioned always with reference to the monographs of the European Pharmacopoeia. And there are a number of benefits for using the CEP procedure. So firstly, it's a centralized assessment, so this would obviously save time and resources. It also facilitates the management of marketing authorization applications and variations. We use it to coordinate and conduct GMP inspections, and it's also a good source of information for updating the European Pharmacopoeia monographs. And lastly, of course, it's open to any manufacturer of pharmaceutical substances, regardless of the geographical origin. And the procedure was implemented back in 1994. So in fact, this year we celebrated 30 years of success of the procedure. And then 5 years later, in 1999, the inspection program was incorporated within it. So now we come on to the EDQM inspection program itself. So this is an integral part of the CEP procedure, and it's applicable to all manufacturing sites involved in CEP applications. We perform our inspections in line with the European compilation of union procedures. So we would take the same approach as all other EU and EEA authorities, just in terms of our approach to GMP inspections and follow-up, etc. And we do have a web page which I encourage you to check out, and you'll always find some more general information and news there about the inspection program. So over the next few slides then we'll run through the various aspects of the EDQM inspection program, just in terms of how we interact with other national competent authorities, how it relates to the European Pharmacopoeia, the EU GMPs that we follow, and how ultimately our job is to ensure patient safety. So to do that, I'll now run through the who, what, where, when, and why for the EDQM inspection program and what results we produce. So firstly then, who performs EDQM inspections? Well, so this would always be a team of GMP inspectors. So typically it's a team of two. A normal EDQM inspection would of course involve an EDQM inspector. Currently there are 4 of us in the department here. So you're meeting half of the team here today actually, in myself and Thomas. So we're in charge of organizing inspections, performing them, of course, and looking after the follow-up. So EDQM would really be the main point of contact for any correspondence relating to our inspections. The other member of the team then, we would always be joined by an inspector from another European National Competent Authority. So this essentially means an EEA authority or Swissmedic. And these are qualified GMP inspectors who work for their own national agencies and volunteer to join EDQM inspections to participate with us. So as well as performing the inspection and being part of the inspection team, it would be the responsibility of the NCA inspector to publish the EU GMP compliance information on user GMDP at the closure of the inspection procedure. So in other words, this would mean publication of a GMP certificate or a non-compliance report, depending on the outcome of the inspection. And then the other possibility, of course, is that we are joined by an inspector from a country which has a mutual recognition agreement with Europe. So this could mean an authority like the US, Canada, or Japan, or those countries which have an MRA in place. But to be honest, that's not very frequent at the moment, and it would tend to be for if we conduct a joint inspection where, maybe we identify that we would both like to inspect the same site within a similar time frame, we could go as a larger inspection team as a joint inspection. So the next question then, what do we do during our inspections? So I guess the main thing we do is check for compliance with EU GMP guidelines. So important to note, since we only perform inspections of active substances and not finished products, the reference guideline would always be EU GMP Part 2, which is essentially the same as ICHQ 7. But we would also refer to specific annexes of the EU GMP guide as relevant. So for example, if we were to do an inspection of a sterile API, of course, we would use Annex 1. Similarly, for herbal substances, we would use Annex 7 as well. So essentially, we're there to review all operations really in terms of manufacturing, quality control testing, quality management system. We review all aspects against the requirements of the EU GMP guidelines. The next thing we always do is to check compliance with the CEP dossier. So there tends to be one substance within scope of our inspections. So here we would verify if the operations conducted on the site are in line with the registered information in the CEP dossier. So for example, here we would potentially review the batch records against section 3.2(s)(22), which will be the description of manufacturing process and process controls section of the dossier. And we would also review the analytical procedures and specifications in use at the company against the registered methods and specs or monograph methods as relevant. And then the last thing we would try to do on inspection is just to check compliance with European Pharmacopoeia monographs. So yeah, as I mentioned, if testing is in line with the monograph, we would check the test method in use at the site. We would also check for compliance with general monographs, which may be relevant to the site, such as purified water or something like that. So then, where do we do our inspections? So this graph here shows the geographical locations of our inspections going back almost 10 years. So the vast majority of our inspections are performed in India and China. So the figure that we determined was approximately 94% of our inspections since 2015 have been in those two countries. And I guess that broadly reflects the number of manufacturers from those countries involved in the CEP procedures outside of those EEA countries and mutual recognition agreement countries. So, we wouldn't, of course, do any inspections within Europe because those sites are supervised by the European national competent authorities. So there's no need for us to go there. So you can see here that this graph shows the distribution of inspections. It's roughly a similar number of inspections in both India and China. There are some other rest of world countries that we will go to as well. But that's where we mainly would do our inspections. Okay, so when do we do inspections then? So currently we would tend to do about 40 on-site inspections per year, and the selection of the sites to be inspected is based on risk assessment. So there's an annual inspection program prepared each year, from which then we would select sites to go and inspect. And we do take a life cycle management approach to the management of sites within the CEP procedure. And I'll just give you some more information on that now and the risk assessment. So we have a process called site status review. So this is essentially a periodic review of site information. It's basically an information gathering exercise where we would consider then if the site should be included within the inspection program for the next year. So yes, as I mentioned, it's information gathering, and we would use this to feed into our risk assessment in order to determine whether a site should be added to the inspection program. So essentially there are two main types of risks we consider. So one of those could be categorized as a site-related risk, and the other would be API-related risks, which are more intrinsic to the substance being manufactured at the site. So then this slide just, I suppose, gives some further information on the different aspects that we consider in the risk assessment. So for example, we might consider the inspection history, so whether the site has been inspected before. Of course, if it has never been inspected by an EU authority or one of our MRA authorities, we would consider the risk to be a little bit higher. Or if it has been inspected before, what is the compliance level? Does it have a good inspection history? Then we also would have a form of intelligence provision from other authorities. So we do speak to other authorities in terms of outcomes from their inspections, or if they have any other suspicions or concerns with the site, we could use this type of information, or indeed we could receive information directly from whistleblowers. So this would all feed into the risk assessment. As well as that, during the assessment process, the assessor might identify something. This could be inconsistencies in the data provided or suspicion of data manipulation. So we do have a process here in the EDQM where the assessors may request that we consider a site for inclusion in the inspection program. And then also we consider other information relating to the company, such as, is it a very large site? Are there any other activities performed aside from pharmaceutical manufacturing? Does the site use shared or dedicated equipment for its manufacturing, and the general approach to contamination control? So I guess all of these types of aspects could be considered as site-related criteria, because they'd be specific to the site in question. Then in terms of API-related criteria, so we consider the physical chemical properties, so the stability of the substance, the risk of impurity formation. We'd also consider microbiological properties, so is it a sterile API or is it a non-sterile API intended for parenteral use? And other pharmacological characteristics such as hormones, is it a chemotherapeutic agent? If the substance is highly potent, it would be considered as slightly higher risk. So all of these types of factors would feed into our risk assessment, and then we would determine if the site will be considered high risk and considered for inclusion on our inspection program for the year. So this slide then just, I suppose, shows the distribution of initial inspections compared to re-inspections going back to 2015, so for on-site inspections only. So I suppose it does highlight that we tend to try and go to sites which have never been inspected before. So you can see there's a slightly higher distribution of sites inspected which are categorized as initial inspections, so haven't been inspected by EDQM before. So again, that's a big factor that would feed into the risk assessment compared to re-inspecting a site which we have some experience with. Okay, so why do we do inspections then? So I suppose probably the primary reason is for the protection of public health. So this is our main concern in order to ensure patient safety. So approximately 12% of EDQM inspections in 2023 and the first half of this year resulted in a non-compliant outcome. So this was where we identified, there was a potential risk to patient safety here. So it resulted in a statement of non-compliance. So I guess this kind of highlights the reason why we go and the importance of conducting these inspections. But also an increased oversight of third country manufacturing sites does tend to lead to a better understanding and implementation of EU GMP requirements. And it does help, the manufacture of products of adequate quality. And over time, we have seen that, as we do more inspections, the number of regulatory actions needed has tended to decrease with time. So, we are seeing somewhat improved compliance levels over recent years compared to, say, 10, 15 years ago. So I guess that shows the benefits of doing these inspections. Also, I guess it's embedded within EU legislation that EDQM has a mandate to perform inspections and establish an annual program for inspections. So yeah, the legislation is there. So it's Regulation 2019-6 and Directive 2001/83 EC. So yes, that gives us a good mandate to go, and that's why we do our inspections as well. And also the last reason, it's an integral part of the CEP procedure. But I guess it's important to note inspections of active substance manufacturers in third countries are not mandatory. So we do we are in line here with EU legislation, and as I mentioned, we take a risk-based approach. So we don't inspect every single site involved in the CEP procedure. Having said that, manufacturing sites must provide a declaration for their willingness to be inspected as part of the CEP application, and they must also declare compliance with GMP. Okay, so onto the results of our inspection program then. So this slide just shows the on-site inspection outcomes going back to 2015. So I guess, yeah, compliant and non-compliant outcomes really. So as I mentioned, I suppose in recent years there probably has been a lower number of non-compliant outcomes compared to maybe 10 years ago. But you know, we still do come across non-compliant sites, and as I mentioned, that the current metric is that it's about 12% of sites we inspect since the start of last year have been non-compliant. So again, the majority compliant outcomes. Okay, so now we'll just go through what a typical inspection would look like. So as I mentioned, it's an inspection team. There tends to be 2 inspectors. Normally it's a 3-day duration. So of course this would be where there's one API within scope, and if it's a non-sterile standard process. So most of our inspections would actually fall into this category, but there is the possibility to extend the duration. So for example, if the substance is sterile, you know, this would require normally 5 days. If the process is complex, you know, we may decide to do an extra day. Or else if the scope is extended or there's specific issues to be checked. So for example, the nitrosamines inspections a few years ago, or if, you know, there's more APIs included within the scope compared to the normal single API. So, you know, so typically 3 days, but it can be extended. We also do inform the local supervisory authorities in advance that we will go to inspect the site on their territory, and they're always invited to participate as an observer. So then this slide, I guess, just shows some of the pre-inspection correspondence that we have with sites. So just to kind of clarify the different types of requests for information you might get from us. So the first one, I suppose, would be as part of the site status review process. So as I mentioned a few slides ago, this is I suppose our approach to site lifecycle management, and it's relevant to all manufacturing sites listed in CEPs. So on a periodic basis, we would reach out to the site and gather certain information and use it for input into our risk assessment in order to determine whether the site should be included on the EDQM inspection program, or whether we could consider it for other inspection reliance activities. So for example, you know, we would check the recent inspection history of the site, you know, if any other authorities have been there. So this is a continual process. So you know, it's performed on a periodic basis. So you know, you will continually get site status review requests for information as long as the CEP is valid, I guess. Then we have a pre-inspection data request. So typically this request would come from the inspection team, where the site is typically under consideration for inspection. So it's essentially a final information gathering exercise where we just make sure that, you know, the information is still relevant, and that we're just fine-tuning our decision for whether to inspect the site or not. But then I suppose it's not determined at this point whether the site will definitely be inspected. This would only be determined at the time you receive an official inspection notification. So yeah, this is official documentation. It's a letter sent to the site containing the dates of the inspection, names of the inspector, and the API within scope. And normally we provide about 6 to 10 weeks notice for inspections. So then this slide just shows an example of a typical inspection agenda, just so you have an idea of what's involved. So as I mentioned, it's typically 3 days. So of course we would start the inspection having an opening meeting. So this would typically involve site management and relevant personnel involved in the inspection. Then afterwards, we would tend to start into the review of documents within the quality system. So for example, straight after the opening meeting, we might review deviations, change controls, complaints, laboratory investigations, and the inspection team would typically split. So if there's 2 inspectors, we would work separately on different topics. So we always request that you have separate streams of personnel available to support each inspector. Then, for example, after lunch, we might focus on the site tour in terms of manufacturing operations. Before we tend to go out on the site tour, we always ask the company to give an overview of the manufacturing process, just to familiarize ourselves before we go to the production facility. So then we would normally walk through the entire equipment train and process flow for the API within scope. And the inspection team may stay together, or we may split depending on the number of workshops within scope of the inspection. So then, for example, on the second day, we might continue our site tour, covering warehouse areas, solvent storage areas, and of course the QC laboratories. So we would always go there to check the data being generated in the labs. Then we would also continue our review of documents within the quality system. So, over all of the relevant GMP topics, so validation, qualification, supplier management. Yeah, I won't go through them all, but this just gives you a flavor of how we structure our inspections typically. Then on the last day, we would finish off any documents outstanding, cover any remaining parts of the site tour that we may not have already covered. For example, utilities like purified water or the HVAC system. If there's any solvent recovery premises applicable, we would also go there. And at the very end of the inspection, we would have a closing meeting where we would give a verbal overview of any findings, and we would explain the follow-up process and for the closure of the inspection procedure. And of course, this is just really an example of an inspection agenda, but the relevant inspection team would determine the order of the topics and aspects to be covered, and it's normally provided to the site about 1 week in advance, so you would have a heads up in terms of what we're looking to cover and the order as well. Okay, so then just to mention our document sharing tool, which we use extensively during our inspections. So it's essentially called the EDQM Active Collaboration Tool. It's basically a cloud system which is used to share documents. So the inspected company would be granted access to a defined folder structure for the upload of documents before and during the inspection. So this is an example of what it looks like. And the data is stored on a secure EDQM server, which is located on site in Strasbourg. So it's all fully secure. We would also use the Common European Submission Platform, or CESP as it's more commonly known, for submission of certain documents. So for example, the CAPA submitted after the inspection would be submitted using this platform. So then just to go through the timelines and the follow-up process for after the inspection. So within 6 weeks, we would aim to issue a list of deficiencies to the site. Then after receipt of that, the inspected site has a period of 4 weeks to provide a corrective and preventative action plan to the EDQM. So this would then be reviewed by the inspection team, and if it's considered adequate, we would then, draft the final inspection report within 6 weeks of receipt of the company's CAPA. However, important to note that if the CAPA is not considered acceptable, and if we consider, it ultimately doesn't address all of the relevant findings of the inspection, we would send a letter back to the site outlining our concerns and where the improvements to the CAPA are needed. And then the timelines would repeat themselves again. So we will go back to this step here where the company would have 4 weeks to address the inspection team's comments, and then we would have a further 6 weeks then to review the updated CAPA plan and draft the final inspection report. So then this slide just shows the different inspection outcomes possible. So of course we have GMP compliant, we have GMP non-compliant where regulatory actions would be taken. And then there's also a borderline outcome. So this is essentially a temporary status we assign to the site, which is not really finalized until after the CAPA review. So I guess these are sites where there are quite a number of significant deficiencies, and I suppose it's on the edge of GMP compliant or non-compliant. So we would give the site an opportunity to submit a CAPA, and if that was considered acceptable, the final outcome would turn to GMP compliant. However, if it's not really possible to implement an effective CAPA, or if there's no real strong commitment from the site to address the issues, then the final outcome would be decided as GMP non-compliant, and subsequent regulatory actions will be taken. So just to give some further information then on the compliant and non-compliant outcomes. So for the compliant outcome, so this of course is prefaced by, there's a satisfactory evaluation of the CAPA, and if any expected application for a CEP revision has been submitted to the EDQM, at that point we would issue a final inspection report and EDQM attestation of inspection, which states compliance with GMP and the CEP dossier within scope. And then the GMP certificate would be issued by the participating European Inspectorate, and it will be published on the UDRA GMDP database. So this will be the other member of the inspection team coming from the European National Competence Authority that would look after that, as I mentioned. Then for non-compliant outcomes, so as I mentioned, this would be where we determine that there's a risk to public health. So the CEP holder and the manufacturer are notified of this decision, and they're given the possibility of a hearing within 14 days of communication of this decision. So all relevant CEPs of the site may be suspended or withdrawn. If there's more than one manufacturer listed on the CEP, the non-compliant manufacturer may be removed. So there may be other compliant manufacturers listed on the CEP, which obviously wouldn't be affected by the non-compliant site. It just depends on the situation and what manufacturers are involved for that specific CEP. Then also, if there's any ongoing CEP applications, they may be closed, and a non-compliance report would be issued by the participating European NCA inspector and published on the user GMDP database. So then, just to go through, I guess, the internal decision-making process we have here in EDQM, I guess, to confirm inspection outcomes after each inspection. So the inspection team would make a proposal for the outcome. So I guess this would either be compliant, borderline, non-compliant. After each inspection, then this is discussed internally within the certification of substances department. So yeah, and ultimately the outcome is confirmed or discussed there. So if it's a compliant outcome, the process would stop there. If there's any proposed regulatory actions, or if the proposal is for a non-compliant outcome, this decision is escalated further to what's called the EDQM ad hoc committee. So, this would involve the EDQM director and other participants as well. So ultimately, it's the decision of this committee if there is any actions to be taken on CEPs. And I would just point you to the publicly available EDQM policy document on the suspension or withdrawal of a CEP or the closure of an application, and that's available on our website, so you'll get further information there. Okay, then just to touch on the other approaches then we have for the supervision of manufacturing sites involved in CEP applications. So we have three methods for the supervision of GMP compliance. So the first one, of course, is on-site inspections and what we've discussed in the presentation to now. The second one will be real-time remote inspections, or Artemis. So I'm sure you're all familiar with this concept, which we brought in as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. So yeah, it's essentially trying to replicate on-site inspections just remotely insofar as possible. And then the third pillar would be what we call GMP assessment. So this is where we consider inspection reliance of other trusted authorities where they may have performed recent inspections of the relevant site. So just to give some more information on the remote inspections, or Artemis. So as I mentioned, yeah, we follow the on-site inspection process and try to replicate this virtually insofar as possible. So of course, we need some IT tools to support us. So document scanners and document sharing platforms are very relevant here. So as I mentioned, we have the ACT platform. We obviously have to communicate via web conference meeting applications. So we typically use Microsoft Teams. We're heavily dependent on Wi-Fi, mobile data for connection. And of course, we need effective cameras to take us through the site tour and the facilities. So as I mentioned, we try follow the normal inspection process. So this would always start with an opening meeting. We would have a real-time visit of manufacturing areas and site facilities. Then we would have a real-time review of the relevant documents and discussion with subject matter experts. And also we would finish with a closing meeting. So essentially we're connected with the firm for the entire inspection. Of course, there will be a time zone difference as we are based here in Strasbourg, and most of the inspections tend to be in India and China. So as a result of that, our days can be a little bit shorter to, I suppose, save us starting really early in the morning, and also to save the inspected company working really late at night. And as a result of that, the duration can be a little bit extended. So it's typically either 5 or 6 days for a remote inspection. So in terms of advantages of the remote inspection process, of course, it allows us the possibility to evaluate GMP compliance when an on-site inspection cannot be performed, or if it's deemed of a lower priority or risk. It does allow very efficient and fast real-time visual interaction with the company. It saves financial resources, both for EDQM and the company, so there's no travel or hotel costs required. Yes, and of course there's no carbon footprint as well, so it's better for the environment. However, there are some limitations or challenges with this approach as well. So mainly we can't use all our inspection techniques remotely. So we don't have any element of surprise really, or body language interpretation. I guess we're completely reliant on the person pointing the camera at the facility to give us our field of view, and with that we can't see any periphery activities. We can't overhear staff conversations, or I suppose have any sense of smell, which may be a risk sometimes in manufacturing areas. And as I mentioned, it can take a little bit longer, and depending on connectivity, the Wi-Fi or mobile data coverage, we can experience some technical difficulties at times, so we're heavily reliant on that. And yes, there are time difference and translation requirements, which are a little bit more challenging when we're not in person. But then, yeah, when Artemis could be used going forward, so yes, of course, if there are travel restrictions introduced again, so if there are pandemic situations, or indeed if there are safety concerns for the inspection team to travel to a certain country, we may consider it. But we do consider it a potential regular process for sites which have showed a good level of GMP compliance during previous inspections. So I suppose it's something that we wouldn't really consider if we don't have any inspection history for the site. But if there is a good site, we could consider for a future inspection. Then for CAPAs, it could be useful for verifying the implementation of a specific part of a CAPA if necessary. And lastly, if an urgent GMP evaluation is needed, so for a specific topic, for example, it is useful that we can connect directly with the site without having to travel. But in this case, the Artemis wouldn't replace an on-site inspection, but it does allow us an option to look at something that might pose a risk to public health. So this slide then just shows, I guess, the proportion of Artemis we've performed compared to on-site inspections in recent years. So I guess the process was introduced in 2020 when the pandemic broke out. Obviously the almost 70% of on-site inspections were obviously performed before the travel restrictions were introduced. Then in 2021, we couldn't travel anywhere, so it was all remote inspections. In 2022, then a reduced proportion of remote inspections, because on-site inspections actually resumed in India in August. So yeah, we went straight back when we could. Then August 2023, on-site inspections resumed in China because the travel restrictions there lasted a little bit longer. And then this year so far, it's been mostly on-site inspections to date. Yeah. So then just to touch on the GMP assessment process that I mentioned as the third pillar of our supervision of GMP compliance. So this has been up and running since 2010. So it's essentially a program for recognition and reliance of inspection performed by EEA or Swiss authorities and other trusted partners, so typically other MRA countries. So it's a desktop or paper-based assessment, and And ultimately, the benefits of this approach is that we can optimize inspection resources and reduce the duplication of inspections of similar manufacturing sites of interest. So in the case where we have a recent inspection by an EEA or Swiss authority, as I mentioned previously, we don't perform any inspections at all in these territories. So we rely directly on the GMP certificates published for those sites for the sites involved in the CEP scheme. So this would essentially be direct recognition. So we just rely on the information published on UJA GMDP, whether it's a GMP certificate or a statement of non-compliance. Then in terms of inspection reports from other authorities, so for example, these could be PICS authorities or MRA authorities. This would be where we would, I suppose, request the inspection report for their recent inspection. We would have a look at the scope, the duration, and the extent of the inspection, and determine whether we can rely on this for our purposes. Was the CEP substance or relevant manufacturing workshops covered within the scope? And if we can leverage off of this inspection, we would try and not duplicate the inspection there and take it into account in terms of recognizing it essentially. Okay, and then kind of on the same topic, this slide touches on the international collaboration that we're involved in. So there's a program for the rationalization of international GMP inspections of API manufacturers. So we participate in a monthly telecon with all of these authorities listed here. And again, you can find more information here through this link. I think this is on the EMA website. So the objectives of this group would be to optimize the use of inspection resources worldwide, and foster greater collaboration and information sharing. So I guess, the aim is to increase inspectional oversight and reduce duplication of inspections to allow more sites to be monitored, and it helps us to build on equivalent GMP standards and mutual confidence between inspections of different authorities. So as I mentioned, we have a monthly meeting where we would I suppose share our inspection plans to coordinate together to try and reduce duplication of inspections, and we would also share information on inspection outcomes. Then other areas where we collaborate internationally, we attend the GMDP Inspector Working Group, which is obviously organised by the EMA. We participate within the PICS committee of officials. We're also involved in working groups for the elaboration and revision of GMP guidelines and documents. So, these, where they're coordinated by the PICS, EMA or ICH, we would tend to be involved where it's relevant for our inspections. And we also do have confidentiality agreements in place where we would share inspection reports with other authorities. So coming to the end of the presentation then, just some final considerations. So I suppose, as I mentioned, the impact of our inspection program, we have found that it has led to a higher level of GMP compliance over the last decade and less regulatory actions. Manufacturing sites tend to have an increased understanding and improve their implementation of EU GMP regulations as a result of our inspections. And recently we have been seeing a lower level of discrepancies to CEP dossiers, I suppose, which demonstrates that companies are increasing their efforts to comply with the commitments and conditions under which the CEPs were granted. Having said that, we feel that finished product manufacturers should still improve their ability to select GMP compliant API suppliers and audit and monitor them accordingly. Yeah, so I guess just to end, I'd like to acknowledge the other inspectors in the team here who helped with the preparation of this, so Thomas, Christina and Sotirius. So thank you very much, and I guess I'll hand over to my colleague for the next presentation.
So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody. And again, it's a pleasure for me also to present EDQM's inspection scheme and a few topics out of this scheme in this context of the EDQM training. Oshin had already introduced the session itself, so I have to move a little bit to be not too close or too exposed to the sun. Sorry for that. The topic of this presentation is basically a bilateral topic. So first, a few slides will talk about how to get ready for an EDQM inspection, what to expect, what is important in the context of it, and then I will take you through typical GMP deficiencies the team has observed in the recent years. So the first slide, Oshin talked already about what we call first contact, which is the site status review. I don't want to spend so much time on it. What I haven't tackled here in this slide is what Oshin also mentioned as PID, pre-inspection information we are asking the firms to submit to us. Both site status review and the PIDs, they are independent from a concrete and specific date of an inspection of a specific site. We've got one question in the submitted. One colleague wanted to know if we can elaborate a little bit more on what is meant by PID. I think Oshin said it already. We want to know in the context of a specific slot and a specific site, does the site supplies, does the site manufacture, what does the site manufacture? Are there any shutdowns which could conflict with the potential slot we had already identified? And most importantly, this is more or less a final moment to clarify whether or not there had already been an inspection by a trusted authority, or one of those inspections is already being scheduled, which means the company had been notified. This is very important for us to rationalize and not to overlap inspections because, as Oshin pointed out, we have a robust process in place to trust and to take other GMP information into account. So this is the basic purpose of the PID. And if we can tick all the boxes and the firms are considered as eligible for inspection, then the second contact kicks in. And this is indeed the notification of an inspection. It is an official document, and it refers to the commitment that was given by the concerned company to host an inspection organized and conducted by the EDQM. This notification of inspection is sent by email, but also by courier, so we can trace at which moment the company did receive this document. It will inform the firm exactly about the dates when the inspection is being scheduled, the inspection team, and also the API that has been selected for this inspection. Since it is relying on the commitment of the firm to host the inspection, if firms decline to accept this inspection without proper and sound rationale or reasons, the EDQM has to assume that the firm is simply not ready for an inspection, and that there might be a risk towards to the quality of the products and even to the patients. So refusal may lead to regulatory actions in the same way as it was pointed out by Oshin in the slide on the decision-making process. This slide gives you a few hints what companies should do once they have received the notification. It's very important that the communication is smoothly and also timely, because you have to bear in mind that we are not organizing one inspection at a time. We always have multiple tasks at the same time to fulfill. So it is important also that the firms concerned are supportive in what is expected from them. Preparing, for instance, and submitting the site master file. Product quality reviews. Sometimes we also ask for specific procedures or historical data on number of deviations, complaints, etc. For most of the countries, we need to apply for a visa. So India is one of our major destinations. We need visas, even though it had been facilitated by the electronic visa. We still ask the firms for invitation letters in case the embassy wants to have a copy of it. So we send out templates and we expect from the firms that they are sent back immediately. We need support, logistic support, hotel booking, and also organizing the transfers from hotel, airport, factory. This should be taken into account, and also in order to let us do our job during the course of the day, we also need something to drink and to eat. So we ask the firms to provide also some simple and easy lunch during the inspection, short, in order not to waste too much time. If the language of the country is not English, so mainly China, then we ask the firms also to appoint skilled interpreters. Usually the EDQM does have an EDQM appointed interpreter with us, but as Oshin pointed out, the team is going to be split up almost all the time. So therefore, a second, backup translator is needed. And not to forget, of course, also expenses have to be paid. So there are the fees for the travel and accommodation, and also the regular inspection fees the firms have to pay to the EDQM. This slide gives you a few ideas what we don't want the firms to do, but this is really based on our experience. At the moment of the notification, we always picture that there is quite some hectic at the sites that are going to be inspected, but truly it doesn't really make sense to notify at this very moment any undeclared changes in the CP dossier. We are going to see it anyway, and the firms are better off if they were just acknowledging this finding and then submit in the normal revision process any changes that needed to be submitted. Interrupt production. We want the firms and the facilities up and running. We had one question in the chat which says, or which was asking, during the on-site inspection of sterile API manufacturer, do you require actually see an ongoing manufacturing process for that API? The answer is yes. Yes, we need to see how this production takes place, in particular if aseptic manufacturing operations are concerned. We often do see the paint, the premises freshly painted, that fresh that we sometimes get even stick on the equipment or on the piping systems. So this is really, really not part of a regular maintenance scheme, and firms should avoid to do that. I think it's out of question that rewriting, creating, manipulating documents should not happen ahead and during the inspection, and neither unscheduled maintenance activities. Drafting new or updated procedures, this we have seen in the past more frequently. Now when, I mean, at least for me, when I'm writing down procedures, names, and etc., and when they were reviewed and entered into force, really firms took this into account, and I can see that this was not usually done in the context of an inspection notification. Same applies for hiring new staff members, unless already foreseen. At this point, it doesn't really make sense to hire new staff because on one hand, the staff needs to be trained, and secondly, also the staff has to have a purpose and not to fill in some gaps which the firm had identified after having received the notification of the inspection. Still not over yet, so some further points to be noted and to be noticed and taken into account. Oshin mentioned it. Since the very beginning, the EDQM informs the local inspectorates about the dates and the scope of the inspections, and we welcome the presence of local inspectors as observers. In India, it barely happens. It was a bit more frequent in the past, but last time I think it was 2019 when I had personally inspectors from Telangana joining, and they said to me it's due to time constraints they are having. In China now it's more frequent that we have observers from different levels of the National Competent Authority. Ahead of the inspection, also Oshin touched upon it, an inspection schedule, an agenda is being sent to the firm together with some general aspects and recommendations. And this banner which I put underneath of this of these 3 bullet points, read carefully the information. We can't highlight it enough. Often we really arrive on site and then expect things to be present, which are, and then we point out at emails or exactly those recommendations, and they haven't been taken into account by the firms. So it is very important really not to read only say the agenda, which is anyway rather generic, but also each and every point which goes into the context of recommendation and also documentation requests. Okay. During the inspection, some general points to consider. I will be very brief because Oshin touched this topic a little bit more in depth. It's very important. 3 days for a regular inspection, 1 API, non-sterile is not much time. The team tries its best to compensate this short time frame by splitting up as much as possible, but nevertheless, we have to get support from the firm, which means documents have to be provided as fast as possible, which means that the war room should be close to the meeting room and not on the other end of the facility, which would cause a delay in bringing over documents we need to see. It is also mainly clear what kind of documents we are going to see. So the vast majority of quality documents, they are anyway expected to be ready and let's say next door. Also very important that the staff members answer to inspectors' questions straightforwardly, and they should answer what they have been asked. Sometimes we realize that there is this trend to answer to what inspectors may want to hear. This does not work because we know already what is to be inspected. So it's very easy. It's an exchange of information during these 3 days. And the better the colleagues are prepared just to provide us the information, no matter what, no second thoughts, the easier for us it is to assess them and to get a picture of the firm and the firm's GMP compliance. The planned tour already been set and touched by Oshin. What we try, or personally what I try lately, is to put the first 2 lines, the storage, warehouses, etc., plus production at day 1. This makes it a very heavy day because we are out all day from the morning after the opening meeting until 6:30, maybe even 7. But this has the advantage for the team that the first picture is being obtained during day 1, and we can relax a little bit at day 2 and day 3, and also adapt to see the things which are important in the context of what we had already seen at day 1. Okay. So during the plant tour, again, the firms have to bear this in mind, and they should not be surprised. We deviate from schedule and suggested directions. It's always the case. Each time we see something, we need to follow things up. This cannot be predicted. It cannot be put into an agenda. It is simply like that. I mentioned it already, and also Oshin mentioned it. The team is going to be split up during the plant tour, which is a challenge for the firm because all of a sudden the firm has to deal with 2 inspection teams instead of 1, which means the appropriate support has to be given to 2 teams. We are aware of this obstacle, and we know that sometimes we have to wait if a subject matter expert is already busy with a colleague, and then we would just simply postpone the topic and come back to it. We may request to any area of the site if we consider it is related to the scope of the inspection. This often we do see some question marks in the faces of the firm, but again, we have our train of thought we need to follow in the context of the evaluation of the site over the course of 3 days. I mentioned already that we ask questions directly to staff members. Digital cameras, it's quite common these days, unless not permitted for safety reasons. So we ask the firms to provide us cameras that are safe, intrinsically safe, also to be used in areas that might be risky in terms of solvents, etc. There are good tools and devices out there, action cameras with appropriate housings, etc. I want to point out we don't need cameras to have evidence for GMP non-compliance or for a rusty reactor. We have our eyes and we have our nose. This is way enough. But the real advantage of taking pictures lies in the follow-up. When we do get a few weeks after the inspection to follow up, it's very easy to compare what we have seen on site at the time of the inspection, talking of a less or not well-maintained reactor, and then in the context of the cupboard, the film submits a picture of the reactor that had undergone maintenance. So this overlay it's very easy and helpful and facilitates the cupboard review. Okay. We don't do a daily wrap-up in order to save time, but in case of severe observations, we call the management and they will have a feedback at that very day. Okay. After the inspection, replies should be fully documented. We need commitments and descriptions of corrective and preventative actions with deadlines. They should reflect what has or what will be done. Copies of procedures is needed to highlighting also again what has changed in order to address the observation. If the procedure is not in English, of course, we need to have a translation into English to have the possibility to evaluate the CAPA. I mentioned already the pictures that can be submitted to make an easy feedback in case of a specific corrective action that can be demonstrated to be implemented by pictures. The replies should be provided in electronic format. PDFs, annexes should be bookmarked. The PDFs should also OCRized so that we can copy paste parts of it into the inspection report. In case of discrepancies with the CP dossier, they are outlined in the list of deficiencies in the report, but we don't take care of the actual submission. This is done in the context of the revision process at the EDQM. Looking at the time, because we have got already quite a number of questions, I don't want to spend too much time on the slides. Moving on to the next part of the presentation, GMP deficiencies. As an overview, this slide shows you the approximately distribution of the deficiencies since 2015. You see a big part is quality related. Laboratory controls, buildings and equipment are the next bigger ones. There is a decrease in the observations and also in the severity of the observations with regard to facilities and equipment, but we do see an increase in quality-related matters. We have discussed multiple times also amongst other regulators. It is certainly also because we are also moving on. If we do see that firms have now embraced the requirements and implemented requirements in terms of buildings and facilities, we go to the next steps. We go deeper into quality-related matters in order to see how the firms are embracing those requirements. Nevertheless, it's not over in terms of facilities and equipment. Just 2 weeks ago, I have been at a site which could have been, which took me back 15 years into the 2000 years because they completely ignored the need of an adequate maintenance of equipment and facilities. But overall, it was a pleasure for us also to see that over the years, those requirements were taken into account, and also that the regulatory oversight nationally, internationally, certainly contributed to this development. So why this increase on quality-related matters? Quality risk management is still, in my opinion, for firms difficult to implement, to grasp, and also to bring it into the facility down to the workshop level. Lack of QA oversight is still around, and the vast majority of, if it comes to major observations, it's almost at any time somehow related to QA oversight. Change control, for me personally, one of the most important parts of the GMP, which is embracing any risk that comes into the picture when something is going to be changed. Investigations, very important, out of specification investigations, complaint, and also deviation investigations. I will show you a few more examples of those observations we have made. We have the inadequate overview of production and laboratory activities. And last but not least, also the control of documentation, paper and electronic, or also hybrid approaches. The R1, many companies, ever since January last year, the ICH Q9 R1 is up and running and in force, but it did not really reach the API sites, or many of the API sites which we are going to inspect, which is a bit of a pity, because this revision, the EDQM was also part of the drafting group, was really triggered also by industry's request to have a better clarity on what level of formality is needed when risk assessments are going to be conducted, and also to really to use the resources more efficiently, and also when balancing between lower and higher level of formalities, to assign the resources of the firm to the more risky issues that need to be tackled by quality risk management. And so what the regulators did, in conjunction, of course, with the industry, was to bring up a revision of ICH Q9, which really reflects that. And I can only invite industry to go to the ICH website. There is a great deal of training material available, which was also being elaborated and published by the same drafting group that was in charge for the ICH Q9 R1 revision. Okay. One example I have taken here, it's number 46, the risk review. And I put this slide into the picture, or into this presentation, because it makes a bridge to, for instance, change control or to investigation. So the deployment of quality risk management processes in those contexts of major GMP processes is of utmost importance. And here we do see still a lot of flaws and failures when performing an inspection. This one is one of those. September 2022, or she mentioned it, we resumed inspections in India, and this was, I think, one of the first sites we have inspected. And very interesting proposal of zero drum handling was made, because when we went on site, we saw that the drum handling on API sites, which is always a little bit of problematic in terms of cleaning, maintenance, dedication, etc. The firm wanted to come over these issues by having no drums at all. So the project was in an advanced stage. Purchase orders were signed. A delivery date for certain material and equipment was already fixed months later. However, the entire change was not supported or not executed in the context of change control management, even though the firm had an as procedure. So you see, what was quoted below is part of the procedure, and this is also a typical example that when one of those templates of core procedures which are out there, which can be purchased, were not only not properly adapted to the firm's needs, but also not executed. So which means that goes all the way down to implementation, and also lack of training and the awareness how important it is to have a proper change control at the very first stage. Another example, for me, extremely important and daily business for API sites which want to embrace new products in order to move their business on. Nevertheless, bringing up a new API in a multipurpose facility is of high risk. And these are typical observations we have made, an extract of multiple films or multiple inspections. the impact was not properly or not correctly addressed. So major areas which are impacted were not identified: process validation, cleaning validation, risk assessment, etc. The SOP on change control identified circumstances when risk assessment shall be performed, but it was this particular SOP restricted to new processes at the facility, QMS, and existing controls, period. So the entire change of equipment was missing and not addressed. And just recently, I had seen 2 weeks ago also that a firm changed equipment from a highly contained equipment and agitated neutral filter dryer to a filter press, which is quite open, exposed the product to the environment. In principle, nothing against the change of that, but the risks that are associated with such a change were absolutely not addressed. The firm did not see it. That comes to the next point, impact related to the proposed change, critical process steps, etc., qualification. So change control is very important, and I usually spend quite some time also on to assess and to understand how the companies are embracing this this important topic that pretty much goes along with the execution of risk assessment in order to avoid any impact on the quality of the products manufactured. And sometimes it's also quite interesting to source from other guidances in terms of getting things on board which might be useful to apply. And what I've put here on the screen is the chapter 5, the chapter on production of EU GMP part 1. This chapter 5 had undergone a revision maybe 5-6 years ago, in particular in order to embrace quality risk management. And here you can see technical and organizational measures for exactly what I was just talking about. For instance, having new products on site. So nobody does need to make reference to such a document, but the ideas which are laid down in other guidance documents can of course be used by firms in order to mitigate risks they may face on their own production facilities. And so this slide, that's a very personal slide. I mean, for inspectors, it's quite nice if they can copy paste efficiencies, and this one I can copy paste in 50% of the cases. The change firms struggle to come up with some examples of changes when it comes to the categorization. What is a minor change? What is a major change? And very, very often, more than 50% actually, I do see that the firm put an up to 10-fold increase of a batch size as a minor change categorization. And then I'm usually making this exact example, which is right here on this slide. Typical input from 400 kilogram would go up to 4,000 kilogram. And in very, very little cases, a facility would be capable to host such a 10-fold increase of a batch size. So what I'm saying here, this 10-fold increased batch size as a minor change comes from a guideline that is not related to GMP at all. It's the guideline on revision and renewals of certificates of suitability, which is aligned with the European guidelines. For an assessor, it doesn't make any difference, or not much difference, if the batch size is simply increased, if all the reagents, reactants, solvents, and the process parameters remain the same. But from a GMP perspective, if one goes up to 4,000 kilograms of input, new equipment is needed, and most likely also a new facility, which means that this change cannot be categorized as a minor change. So pretty much what I'm saying is this batch size increase can be minor, but does not necessarily have to be minor. This is a case-by-case decision. Examples on insufficient investigations and actions. This was quite nice for a presentation like this example. The firm received a complaint that the drug product manufacturer found a gasket in the API. The firm investigated, the API manufacturer investigated, and found out that this gasket came from this butterfly valve. So far so good as it comes to the root cause, but in terms of preventative action, instead of removing this inadequate valve, or removing the risk that the gasket could fall into the product, the firm decided to add a sieving step after the micronization, which means they were still assuming that the gaskets could fall into the product, and to mitigate the risk, they would identify and take out this gasket whilst sieving. However, the detectability is increased through the sieving process, but of course it did not remove the root cause, and also the product is unnecessarily exposed to the environment just in order to find potentially a gasket that has been fallen off of a valve. Some indicators of ineffective deviation and kappa management. So this is what triggers alarm when we are on site, and it should also trigger alarm or raise attention of QA staff on site. If investigations are not holistic and or comprehensive, this is often what we do see. The desperate search for root cause, putting any root cause into the picture, tick the box off, and come up also with quickly with some kappa. This might be partially okay, it might not be okay, but often it's not comprehensive. Root cause is not supported by scientific rationale, not robust. High rate of recurrent deviations, recurring kappas for the same issue, significant number of critical deviations, planned deviation. There is no planned deviation. You cannot plan a deviation. This goes into the contrary to the concept of what is a deviation. Deviation is history. Open deviations investigation for a long time, only few deviations underreported. This you unfortunately often do see. Oh, we haven't had any deviation for this API in over 1 year. This never happens. This is next to impossible. Okay, so that's why this raises concerns. Incorrect categorization, okay, could be a lack of training, could also be a bit sloppiness. This is very important. And the similar indicators also apply for other specification investigations and complaint investigations, of course. So points to consider. Often we speak of terminology. I mentioned planned deviation, for instance. What is a deviation? What is a complaint? Complaint or deviation incident. So where to draw the line? Well, firms can be very creative in terms of terminology in order to meander their way around. But in order to apply appropriate quality procedures and processes, the terminology is very important. Okay. The scope, products, areas covered, triggers for investigation. Okay. Assignment of responsibilities, very important. The chain of notifications, again, workshop level, receiver, etc. Traceability has to be there. What are the immediate actions to remove imminent risks? And then again, the investigation and risk analysis, level of detail, holistic approach, recurrence, and also the inclusion of appropriate subject matter experts. Root cause determination, I said it already, impact assessment, to be released products on the markets, flow of investigations, who is going to be involved, who approves, thorough documentations, adequate corrective actions, preventative measures, and always involve the guys from the quality assurance to have the responsibility, overarching responsibility. GMP violations in terms of documentation. Okay, there are a few points here on the screen. Rewriting of documents in order to demonstrate acceptable, expected, or presentable results, values, or dates. We have seen untimely recording of operations, sometimes even before the operation took place or very late. The use of loose sheets instead of bound logbooks. This is a bit decreasing, but we have seen in the past very frequently that there is basically no control over the issuance and reconciliation of documents, unavailability of records, and raw data not maintained for GMP activities performed by outsourced service providers, for instance, calibration. Okay. Personnel training, very important. I mean, the training matrices and they're usually there, also the individual training, but what still is being missing is the in-depth training, the evidence of training, and also the assessment of the training. really clearly recorded. And one of my favorite trainings I'm going to ask for these days is a training on computerized systems. So I'm grabbing the IT responsible persons and I'm questioning a little bit on the Annex 11 or computerized systems, etc., just to see to which extent this person is really being trained and also aware also of ongoing developments like the current revision of Annex 11. And if this is not the case, then it's going to be cited as a deviation and the person is undergoing, and in the context of the CAPA, inadequate training. Gowning, often also issue that the operators gowning is not in line with the procedure, or that the gowning requirements are not defined. Materials management, as you can picture, this is a huge area where we can find issues. Approval management of vendors, key starting materials, intermediates. Intermediates is in bold because this is one of the problems we still do see, that firms don't really see the difference between the key starting material impact or the regulatory impact of what's the key starting material or intermediates, which have to be manufactured according to GMP. They are part of the common technical document. They are part already of the GMP manufacturing processes. No data available to support retest expiry dates and for intermediates, inadequate identification of material statuses, solvent deliveries not qualified, missing on an approved vendor list. Yeah, you can see there are a few issues which we still do see, even though they are easy to embrace and also to rectify. Buildings and equipment, I mentioned it, the number of and severity of observations decreased. Nevertheless, it's still ongoing risk of contamination, cross-contamination because of improper design, inadequate cleaning and maintenance of equipment, labeling, lack of appropriate user requirements, specifications, etc. Cleaning validation, firms are also getting better in the understanding what is needed, but still we do see issues here. The macro limits, swap sample limits, no data available to support dirty hold times, campaign lengths, no deviations were raised to investigate failures in routine cleaning, if verification samples have been taken, etc. I don't want to spend so much time on this slide. Process validation also got better. Still, there are some issues in the extent of what is going to be validated. For instance, the recovery of solvents, blending or micronization steps. And yeah, the last bullet point, conclusions not drawn with regard to the reasons of the validation. I still do see that quite frequently. There is a trigger, let's say, the change of a piece of equipment, and what the firm is doing is a whole job, the 3 batches, standard validation. But at the conclusion section, I do only see, yes, products, 3 batches met the quality criteria. No talks about what was actually the reason and were there any issues with this particular change of the equipment, if this was the trigger for the validation. This is still lacking. There's a whole job done, lots of work, but the firms often fail to embrace and to discuss what actually was the change about. Okay. Critical process parameters not identified. Okay. Yeah. So other areas, production, blending of batches without appropriate testing, we still do see. Solvent recovery operations, often there are still issues around traceability, often, very often. I also saw it this year quite a few times. Outsourced subcontracted activities, insufficient qualification of subcontractors against GMP, and I also mentioned intermediates. Often intermediates are outsourced, and I have just seen there was also a question on intermediates in the list of queries submitted to Oshin. We will come back later to this. Quality agreements without or with poorly identified responsibilities and an insufficient oversight of the GMP activities performed by subcontractors. Firms give away responsibilities and oversight. So that's why there is a separate chapter on outsourced activities also in the Q7, and it is extremely important that the firms follow the requirements to ensure that the product or whatever comes back, which serves a service or the product, does not lead to any decrease in the quality of the products manufactured. QC. Okay, yeah, fraudulent practices, testing into compliance, deleting OS results. Again, I still have seen it 2 weeks ago, that HPL series injections were repeated and the OS one ignored, not reported. Insufficient records, reagents used, sample weight printouts. This got better. Microbiological testing, time of entry, removal of samples from to incubator not recorded, insufficient traceability. Yes, and then as for the chemical reference standard, the absence of the European Pharmacopoeia chemical reference standard still often an issue, and also problems in the establishment of secondary standards based on primary official standards. Computerized systems, also an ongoing topic. I mean, after the breaches of data integrity had been identified 10 years ago, firms and also suppliers of applications and computerized systems were way more aware of it. So the number of breaches in data integrity decreased. This is really good news, at least from my experience or from our experience. But still, we see two lacks of appropriate user requirement specifications when purchasing new systems. The outdated operating systems or applications is an ongoing topic. I mean, since Windows 7, the famous Windows 7, which is still around, we see it even though it was more than 4 years ago, or almost 4 years ago, no, almost 5 years ago, when the support by the supplier Microsoft stopped, and we face the same, or industry and regulators face the same issue in October next year, when the support of Windows 10 stops and the operating systems have to be shifted to Windows 11. Insufficient management of access levels, risk of loss of traceability, insufficient knowledge of computer systems validation requirement. It's still around. Firms struggle with it. Nor insufficient review of audit trails, and also insufficient controls to prevent data manipulation. I usually spend quite some time on checking the privileges of the analysts by going through the famous, around, give or take, 140 privileges in the various applications of HPLC software. And sometimes you can really see that privileges given could directly lead to breaches in data integrity. So it's extremely important that firms pay attention to this. And also, as I mentioned, IT staff is lacking or even without knowledge of GMP requirements. This is just an overview view slide on the breaches of data integrity. Documentation practices, laboratory controls, validation controls, and computerized systems. That was the last slide. So we have about half an hour left for the questions. So thank you very much for your attention. And I think now Oisin and myself, we are going to take the questions on board as many as we can. Thank you.
Okay, so I think I'll start with some of the questions that came in during my first presentation. So the first one here, on what basis will EDQM inspections be initiated? Just looking at the timestamp there, that came in pretty early during my one. So I hope I kind of answered that during the presentation after that question came in, but yeah, okay, thank you. So we'll move on to the next one. Does EDQM inspection also conduct for intermediate facilities which are referenced in CEP applications? Yes, so the answer to that is yes, we can conduct inspections of intermediate manufacturing sites. So it's a condition of the CEP application that the intermediate manufacturing site declares that they comply with GMP and that they are also willing to be inspected. So yes, we can do inspections. Sometimes you do it as I kind of mentioned, it would be considered as part of the risk assessment, I guess, in the substance-related criteria. Okay, then there's another question. If the firm has been audited and granted GMP cert for a few products in scope, yeah, I think what essentially the question is, what is the procedure for adding more APIs in the GMP certificate? There's a couple of questions like this, so I think I'll just try and answer it once. But I guess within EDQM inspection, typically it's one API within scope. But as I mentioned during my presentation, it's the responsibility really of the participating National Competent Authority inspector to publish the GMP certificate. So I guess it's really a decision for the national authority joining us in line with their own procedures, given that we don't publish them ourselves. So I think any queries like that should be directed to the participating authority. But I mean, it should be borne in mind that it's only one API within scope. It's also, I suppose, not a legal requirement for APIs to be listed on GMP certificates for sites in third countries in order to get approval for the product. So yeah, that should be taken into account as well. Okay, the next question, do API manufacturers have to register with EDQM to be able to supply APIs for drug product manufacturers that submit marketing authorization applications? So I guess this is more of a question for assessment, but essentially, I mean, there's different ways to register an API within a European product dossier. So either the CEP procedure, which of course would be through EDQM, but there's also the active substance master file route, which can also be taken. Okay, the next question for me, for non-sterile API, is it required to do microbiological testing if the same are not part of the monograph? Also, many times MAA asks to provide stability data still if they are not part of the approved specification. Look, I think that's probably more of a question for assessors again. I mean, as part of the assessment, it will be determined if microbiological specifications are required. And look, if it's not in the monograph or in any other part of it.
And it's really a customer issue. I mean, many customers just want to have it because they don't need to have to do it necessarily.
Thanks, Thomas.
Yeah.
So yeah. Okay, next question. How is it possible to know the information on non-compliant sites? So, I mean, I guess that's relating to our inspections. We have a web page which I suppose summarizes recent actions taken on CEPs. So you can see if there's a CEP which has either been suspended or withdrawn due to a GMP non-compliance, but also information on user GMDP. You can search for statements of non-compliance there as well. And there tends to be a clarifying remark if the inspection was performed in the context of the EDQM inspection program. Okay, yeah, there's a question on, can I elaborate on PID? I think Thomas kind of covered that during his presentation as well. So next question, based on which criteria does the EDQM decide that an inspection should be triggered in cases where the CEP holder is not the same company as the API manufacturer? Can you please explain the points that should be considered by the CEP holder side in terms of an inspection, and what points would EDQM cover? Okay, and then I see our guidance document on CEP holder responsibilities during inspections is referenced. So yeah, I mean, look, that's the main guidance document, obviously, to look at. We would tend to go through that document and check for compliance during the inspection. So it's important to make sure that all of those points are covered by the CEP holder. Yeah, I mean, in terms of triggering an inspection because the CEP holder is different to the API manufacturer, that's not something that we would really consider at this point anyway. So yeah, I guess the only thing from a CP holder point of view is just ensure that you comply with your responsibilities as outlined in that public guidance document available on our website. Okay, next question. Is a non-compliance report issued even if it was first EU inspection for that site and they have no GMP certificate? So yeah, I guess it's implied in this question that the outcome of the inspection was non-compliant. So I mean, the answer would be yes. Normally, a non-compliance report would be issued if it's the first inspection and they have no GMP certificate. Okay. Okay, then if a site is deemed non-compliant, can they reapply immediately? Do they have to wait a certain time before reapplying? So, I mean, I guess it really depends on the specific situation. There's different types of regulatory actions we take depending on the outcome. So CEPs can be suspended or like withdrawn. So ultimately the application closed. If it's suspended, it tends to be for a period of time, but a prerequisite for restoration would of course be a successful reinspection. So the typical period for suspension is 2 years. So yeah, I mean, that's normally the case, and we would do a reinspection before any restoration. But of course, it's the most important point is that the issues identified during the non-compliance inspection have been fully addressed and the CAPAs have been implemented. Whereas if it's the CEP applications or dossiers are withdrawn or closed altogether, a new application would have to be submitted and it would have to go through the assessment process and a reinspection scheduled as part of that as well. So yeah, that's the normal process. Then the next question, what is the frequency of reinspection? So I suppose there's no standard reinspection frequency, and I hope this came across during my presentation. Our inspection programs are compiled based on a risk assessment approach. We have a life cycle management review of sites through the site status review program. So on a periodic basis, we would gather information from the site, feed it into the risk assessment, and then determine if the site should be included on the inspection program. So it's not necessarily a fixed reinspection frequency. Okay, then the next question for me, how many rounds of CAPA do you usually exchange with the manufacturer, and what is the maximum number before deciding on the final outcome of the inspection? So look, again, this will kind of depend on the outcome of the inspection, but of course we prefer and strongly encourage that companies submit a comprehensive CAPA the first time, which saves time for both us here in the inspection unit, and also it saves time for your company. So yeah, typically we don't need to go beyond 2 rounds of correspondence. But I mean, yeah, it would be a cause for concern if the process was dragging out, multiple rounds were required. That would really indicate the site doesn't understand the GMP requirements or the inspection team's expectations. So, and look, again, I suppose the significance of the findings would factor into this as well. If it's a borderline site and the company aren't showing a commitment to address the findings, we could take a decision then to go to the ad hoc committee and propose a non-compliant outcome. But yeah, so we always strongly encourage comprehensive CAPAs. Okay, yeah, there's one more question there for me on the procedure for adding products to GMP certs, and again, I answered that earlier. So I think at this point I'll hand over to my colleague Thomas to answer questions as well. Thank you.
We have a question. Please advise during on-site inspection for sterile API manufacturers, both guidelines, Utralex and Annex 1 was issued on 22nd of August 22 to be main focused on due to certain changes like RAPs. Is it mandatory for aseptic filling line in spite of traditional aseptic filling lines? So first, Utralex and Annex 1 is the same. Annex 1 is published as part of Utralex, which is the European legislation. Utralex Part 4 on the medicinal products. RAPs, the idea of putting more information on RAPs, restricted access barrier systems like open close RAPs, was that there were many queries and uncertainties in the previous annex. So that's why this section was really expanded to provide more clarity to industry. And of course, from a risk point of view, RAPs mitigates risks on microbiological contamination of products manufactured in an aseptic environment. But nothing says that RAPs has to be used compared to traditional aseptic filling lines. It's good practice. This is out of question. And if firms don't employ RAPs, then they have to mitigate the risks that go along with the traditional aseptic filling lines. And this is subject also, of course, to an GMP inspection. Okay. Next one. Is there any arrangement where inspectors from developing countries can participate in EDQM physical inspections, particularly of capacity building? That's a good question. Well, at the moment, it would be difficult. As said before, we invite the colleagues from the local competent authorities to participate as observers. But picturing that we were having colleagues from other agencies than us and the local one, I think it would be rather difficult to get them on board. On one hand, for the firm to get the legal context of it, but also in the context of participating as an authority. I am not sure. Maybe in the future it can be discussed if there were confidentiality agreements between European agencies or EDQM and those agencies from developing countries. But the framework for such a participation would need to be established. Okay. Next one, following inspection, we usually present inspection findings to a peer review committee, which then ranks the findings and makes the conclusion of the status to the facility. This is sometimes time-consuming because it may not be easy to assemble the required quorum of the committee. How is it done at the EDQM? The findings, the EU system is a little bit different from for instance, from the system in the United States, because the inspectors are a substantial part of the decision-making process, as also pointed out by Yoshin when he spoke about our decision-making processes. What we mentioned, or what we call internal decision board, IDB, this is basically a review. We bring back, this meeting takes place each time after inspection, just to bring back if deficiencies, the major and critical deficiencies, they are going to be discussed. It's also feedback to management to see what are the developments. But this peer review, we don't really, I mean, this is the only part of peer review we would have. And of course, the colleague from the National Competent Authority is doing the same at her agency. At the end of the day, the list of deficiencies is the conclusion of the inspectors with some input of our colleagues. Okay. Then Federico, it is not clear to me at what stage of the process the GMP assessment is carried out. It's basically a constant process. So Oshin mentioned the API monthly teleconferences. So when we do know that sites have been inspected by trusted authorities, for which we can easily obtain inspection reports, they are of English language, then we would reach out and ask for those data and take them into account. And of course, in this case, if this was possible, then the site is postponed and not subject to a future, a closed time frame inspection. They go back into the circle of risk assessment, but of course the risk is lower because it had been mitigated by information from trusted authorities. Next question, among the on-site inspections performed annually, which is the percentage of inspections taking place at manufacturing sites of intermediate stage materials? Are the same criteria applied by EDQM to trigger an inspection to intermediate stages manufacturing site as those considered for the API manufacturing sites? The risk assessment remains, the criteria or the way the risk assessment is going to be executed is exactly the same. But certainly and logically, intermediates are of lesser risk than APIs. Because potential impurities can be purged by further manufacturing steps. But this is totally depending on what kind of intermediate we were talking about. Is it an advanced intermediate? How many stages of the production take place? What is the intermediate? Are there already some toxicological, pharmacological properties of intermediates? So this is no answer we can give because this really is the outcome of a risk assessment. Okay. Should change owners be stipulated in the change control SOP? I would not see why change owners should be in the SOP because the change is so flexible, or changes are so flexible. What we would like to see and what is needed to be seen is clear who takes charge of it. Either QA needs to have a head chopped off or we need to have a head chopped off if the change control was not executed properly. But in the SOP, I would not see that. If planned deviation is not reasonable, what is a reasonable way to describe a slight change from an approved change with justification and no risk to the product? As I have said, planned deviation does not work because deviation is history. If something is in the future, if something is going to be changed intentionally, then the whole change control procedure applies, period. Next question. Source mentioned the storage under argon and EP under nitrogen. How can we proceed? I'm not sure if I understand the question. I don't know. Storage conditions are defined based on the material and its chemical and physical chemical properties. I don't think that there can be any guidance on whether or not argon as inert gas or nitrogen is used. Reinspection criteria, I think Oshin answered it already. Then the next one, can USP CRS be used for testing when the European Pharmacopoeia CRS is not available? As an example, out of stock, this is risk management. Firms have to demonstrate suitability. What is the CEP procedure in the rest of the world? We are quite proud because CEPs are acceptable in a number of non-European countries, embedded into legislation, most recently in Brazil, but also in Australia and a few other countries. And sometimes we do not even know that countries are using CEPs in their pharmaceutical or in their submission of marketing authorizations. 8 minutes left. When can we receive the EDQM inspection notification after the submission of the initial application of an API? It's one of those questions that's revolving around. As said multiple times also by Shane in his slides, it's a risk-based approach. There is no need also in the European legislation to have mandatory inspections of APIs. Okay. Yeah, Sam, next question. We have recently approved a couple of CEPs. So what's the EDQM plan for the GMP audit at the manufacturing site? Answer, risk assessment. If qualified equivalent standby instrument is available at site, still risk assessment of the instrument is required. This will be determined during the qualification and of the equipment and also its use, its criticality. But if it's going to be used, of course, it has to be qualified. And if during the qualification, a risk assessment needs to be executed, so it has to be executed. But this is not a yes or no answer. It depends. How are the activities distributed among the stakeholders, in brackets, EDQM members? There are 2 inspectors, but how many people are involved in total? Not so sure if I understand the question. If it comes to the inspectors at the EDQM, Oshin mentioned it, there are 4 of us. Team has been built, one of us, one of an NCA, and our objective is to have 40 to 50 on-site inspections per year. So this is basically the distribution, one of us and one of an NCA. Is it mandatory to use the same companion reference standard for testing purpose followed by EDQM reference standard can be used for USP monograph testing procedure or vice versa? I don't think so, unless the comparability has been demonstrated. Is it mandatory to include microbiological testing and stability studies for non-sterile API? There is no GMP guideline that says that. Next question. If an intermediate/non-sterile API is outsourced and only purification and sterilization is carried out in-house, what will be the approach of EDQM in granting CP as a sterile material? This is an assessment question. We cannot answer to that. The next question is whether a GMP inspection from EDQM is mandatory for API, for CP API facilities. This we have already answered. Next question, is it mandatory for EU GMP marketing authorization applications for sterile finished products to get a CP grade API? Well, I think Oshin said it at his initial slides, the scope of the CP procedure. So of course it can be used, I mean, the CP of a sterile API can be used in a marketing authorization application, but it doesn't have to be. It could also be an ASMF or the full information in the marketing authorization application. Storage condition for reference standard for almost all EDQM items is 2 to 8 degrees, while in the USP are different. So what will become the recommended storage condition for in-house prepared working standards for routine lab in use? So we would expect the same storage conditions as for the official chemical reference standards. What is the standard frequency of supplier audit? This is a GMP question that can only be answered by the firms itself. There is no GMP guidance out there. When we are on site, of course, we will check if the frequency is adequate and is addressing the criticality of whatever the supplier is going to supply. Potable water is used in the last stage of API manufacturing process. Is it mandatory to include BET test? Oshin?
I think, does that stand for bacterial endotoxin?
Endotoxin test, yeah. No, well, no, the specification of the potable water has to be agreed upon, and it also depends on the API itself. I would not connect the microbiological specification in the final API depending on the water that's going to be used in the last manufacturing process, if this has already been agreed, let's say in the regulatory filing. Right, Oshin?
Yeah, I fully agree. Yeah. I mean, it's up to the assessor to determine the specification.
3 minutes left. I think we are going to make it. Next question. Is the GMP inspection team made only of GMP inspectors, or there are other situations when other experts are included in the EDQM inspection team? In 99% of the cases, it's just only GMP inspectors, but if we would have, I mean, God forbid, another nitrosamine crisis, we might call for assessors to join. This had happened during the first inspections in the context of the nitrosamine contaminations. But normally the GMP inspectors can do the job. The next question, is there any single pilot inspection program conducted by authorities for 2 to 3 regulatory authorities conduct the inspection together at the same time at the facility? Now, no, this is exactly what we try to avoid, unless we call it a joint inspection. So let's say EDQM, again, let's go back to this pilot project, to this API project amongst the teleconferences. If we were identifying common interest of, let's say TGA is interested in the site as well as EDQM does this, we might agree to perform a joint inspection, which means a colleague from the TGA would join the EDQM inspection team, or vice versa, and then the scope of the inspection could either be extended if more than one API, or different, depending on the agency, different APIs are in the scope. but it's not in pilot inspection program, so that it is set up in order to have 2 to 3 regulatory audit authorities at the same time at the facility. That would also a little bit too much. But joint inspections, of course, it is possible. And Oshin mentioned it had already been taken place in the past. But then the agenda is adapted. So basically, the company handles one inspection team that is composed of more than 2 regulatory authorities, but ideally with 1 inspection report at the end of the day. Creation, this is not in the scope of this presentation. We may forward this to our laboratory colleagues. And the last question, what will be the procedure to get 1 more product added to in this GMP certificate after 1 year of inspection? I think this question had already been addressed. The new product was already part of the manufacturing site at the time of the inspection. But as said again already by Oshin, 3 days, 1 product, and this 1 product will appear in the GMP certificate in at least for certain countries. When I was working at German inspectorate, of course, in this case, being in charge of the facility, we could extend GMP certificates and adding substances. But those country inspections, they focus usually, or the GMP certificate is issued based on the number of APIs in the scope of the inspection. And I think this was the last question, and it's 1 minute past noon. 1 more. Would you please share the presentation? I think this is an answer our colleagues from our public relations department is going to give. So thank you very much, Oshin. Do you want to add something?
No, just thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much for your interest and all of your many questions. It was very exciting to see such a response. Thank you very much.